Well, there you are. You have arrived. Welcome, dreamer, to Cozy Tales Collective, where time slows, whispers take shape, and every flower has a story to tell. The fountain hums its quiet melody just beyond the bend, and a cozy nook awaits beneath the willow's embrace, perfect for those who dream and wonder. But before we begin, subscribe to this channel and comment where you are listening from. But before we begin, let's settle into place. Take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. Let the day melt away as you sink into a place of comfort and stillness. Feel the weight of your body resting against your bed, fully supported, fully at ease. Close your eyes and soften your breath. With each inhale, invite peace. With each exhale, release any lingering tension. Let go of the thoughts of the day. They can wait until tomorrow. Right now, all that matters is this moment. Imagine a warm, gentle light surrounding you, like a soft blanket of calm. It soothes your mind, relaxes your muscles, and welcomes you into a space of quiet serenity. Your mind is open yet at peace, ready to drift into a world of imagination. Soon, a story will begin, a gentle journey to guide you into deep, restful sleep. Take one more deep breath in and let it go. You are safe, you are relaxed, and you are ready to dream. Now let the story begin. 15 years is a long time, long enough for the scars to fade but never disappear. Long enough for a town to rebuild, but never forget. I stood in front of the smoothed-over lot where Callahan's grocery once stood, notebook in hand, as the December wind threatened to steal my pages. There was nothing left but an empty stretch of land and a plaque commemorating those who had been lost in the fire. Ethan Cole's name wasn't on that plaque, though maybe it should have been. He had been 18 then, barely more than a kid, when the fire consumed half of the town's main street. He had rushed in, dragging people from the inferno, saving lives when trained firefighters couldn't. The town hailed him as a hero, but he had lost someone that night too. His best friend, Noah Pierce, hadn't made it out. Now, Ethan was a man I barely knew beyond the headlines and the whispers. Some said he had never been the same after that night. Some said he still woke up screaming. I had been assigned to write a piece marking the 15th anniversary of the fire for the Riverview Gazette. A tribute, they called it. A way to remember. But from the moment I started digging, I felt something was off. The story had all the makings of a legend, the selfless hero, the tragic loss, the town's gratitude. But legends were rarely the full truth. When I arrived at the coffee shop where we'd arranged to meet, Ethan was already waiting, nursing a black coffee in a corner booth. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, though he wasn't yet 34. His eyes, sharp and piercing, tracked me as I approached. "Olivia Carter?" he asked, his voice smoother than I had anticipated. "Liv," I corrected, sliding into the seat across from him. "Thanks for meeting with me." He shrugged. 15 years feels like a lifetime, feels like yesterday. I clicked my pen. I appreciate you being willing to talk about it. He took a sip of his coffee. I figure if people are going to keep telling this story, it might as well be the truth. Then let's start there, I said, flipping to a fresh page. That night. Tell me what happened. He exhaled, glancing toward the window. I was working late at the auto shop when I smelled the smoke. By the time I got to Callahan's, the whole place was up in flames. People were screaming inside. I didn't think. I just ran in. I let the silence settle before prompting. How many people did you save? 5, he said. Maybe 6. It's hard to remember. It was chaos. I watched his face. No hesitation, no embellishment, just facts. And Noah? His jaw tightened. He was behind me when I went in. We got separated. The ceiling caved in before I could find him again. I nodded, jotting down notes. You were injured too, weren't you? His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Smoke inhalation, a few burns. I got off easy. His modesty was almost too perfect, too rehearsed. Something about his story wasn't lining up. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a gap, a missing piece. I had read the old reports. I had spoken to survivors. The timeline was fuzzy, details inconsistent. And now, sitting across from the man at the center of it all, I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't telling me everything. Did you see Noah go in? I asked. Ethan's gaze flicked to mine, something unreadable in his expression. Yeah, he said after a pause. I saw him. The pause was too long. I underlined something in my notes. So why didn't he make it out? I pressed. He tensed. You think I know? His voice was even, but there was an edge beneath it. You think I left him in there? I raised my hands. I didn't say that. His fingers tightened around his cup. Noah was my best friend. Then why does his sister think there's more to the story? His face went blank, a perfect, practiced mask. Sophia. She says Noah was afraid of fire. He would never have run into that building. Ethan leaned back, his jaw working. She wasn't there. She thinks you were covering for him, that he was already inside when the fire started. Ethan exhaled sharply. You've been digging. That's my job. His fingers tapped against the table. Noah. He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth. He huffed a quiet laugh. The truth is, I tried to save him. I failed. Maybe that was true. Maybe that was the only truth he could live with. But as I watched Ethan Cole, town hero, I had a sinking feeling that the real story, the one no one had ever told, was buried in the ashes of that fire. And I wasn't leaving until I found it. I had spent hours hunched over my laptop, eyes scanning through pages of old police and fire department reports. The official ruling had been clear. The fire that took everything from the Wallace family had been an accident. Faulty wiring, they said. A tragic, unfortunate mishap. But then, buried deep in the records, I found something that made my stomach twist. A witness account that contradicted everything. According to the official report, the fire had started in the living room. but an old statement, barely legible from the grainy scanned document, told a different story. A man named Robert Lyle, who had lived across the street at the time, had sworn he'd seen something strange that night. A shadowy figure moving around the Wallace home before the flames erupted. He even mentioned seeing a flash of light, almost like an accelerant being ignited. But his statement wasn't in the final report. It had been buried, hidden under layers of bureaucracy. That's where Detective Marcus Reed came in. I had first come across his name while combing through the case file. Reed had been assigned to the fire investigation back then, but somewhere along the way, his involvement had faded into the background. His notes, what little I could find, hinted at missing evidence. Things had disappeared, leads had gone cold, and the case had been closed faster than it should have been. I needed to talk to him. Tracking down a retired detective wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. I started with a few calls to the precinct, but they weren't exactly forthcoming with information. Eventually, a few online searches and a little bit of social media digging led me to a small, rundown bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people went to be forgotten. Reed was there, nursing a whiskey in a dimly lit corner. He looked up as I approached, eyes wary, assessing me in seconds. Years of experience had made him good at reading people. "You're a long way from home, Miss Carter," he said, voice rough like gravel. I didn't bother asking how he knew who I was. "I need to talk to you about the Wallace fire." His expression darkened, and for a moment I thought he might shut me down entirely. But then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before gesturing for me to sit. "That case was closed a long time ago," he muttered, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Regret? Frustration? "Not to me," I said. "I found Robert Lyle's statement." That got his attention. His grip on the glass tightened slightly. That statement wasn't supposed to be lost. But it was, I said. And so was the evidence. He let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Then tell me." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he pulled a crumpled napkin from the table and scribbled something down. An address. "You want the truth? Start there." I took the napkin and met his gaze. What am I going to find? He leaned back, finishing his drink in one swig. The first crack in a very big lie. The address led me to an abandoned storage unit on the west side of town. The place was surrounded by a rusted fence, weeds growing wild between the cracks in the pavement. I picked the lock, something I'd learned out of necessity more than anything else, and slipped inside. The air smelled of dust and mildew, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead gave the place a ghostly quality. There were boxes stacked haphazardly, some labeled with numbers, others blank. I rifled through them, searching for anything that connected to the Wallace fire, and then I found it. A box marked Reed. Inside, I uncovered a series of photographs, charred remains of what used to be a room, and what looked like an evidence bag containing a melted gas canister. There were also notes, scribbled hastily in the margins of reports. One word stood out, circled multiple times: arson. The official report had ruled the fire an accident, but here was the proof that it had been deliberate. Someone had wanted that fire to happen, and they had gone through a lot of trouble to make sure the truth never came out. I took photos of everything with my phone, heart pounding. If this was just the first crack, what was the rest of the lie? I stood on Angela Monroe's front porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath my weight as I hesitated before knocking. The house was modest, but well kept, its white paint only slightly weathered by time. I tightened my grip on my notepad, forcing myself to push forward. The widow of Robert Monroe had refused to speak with reporters, but I wasn't just another reporter. I needed to understand what had happened in that fire, and I had a gut feeling that she knew something. The door opened a fraction before I could even knock, as if she had been expecting me. Angela Monroe's tired, dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. Fear? Resignation? "I'm not interested in speaking to the press." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not just the press," I said gently, keeping my tone neutral. "I knew some of the people in that fire. I just want the truth." Angela exhaled, gripping the doorframe. "There's no truth to tell. It was an accident." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Was it?" For a moment something crossed her face, a hesitation, a flicker of conflict, but she quickly masked it. "Please leave," she whispered. "I can help," I insisted, leaning in. "If you're afraid of something—" The door slammed in my face. I stood there for a long moment, my heartbeat quickening. She was scared. But of what? As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from my father, Jack Carter. "Liv, stop asking questions. Let this go." My breath caught. I hadn't told him about my visit to Angela. How did he know? And more importantly, why was he warning me off? That night, I sat at my desk, flipping through the notes I had gathered. The fire had taken 5 lives, including Robert Monroe's, and yet something about it didn't sit right. Witness reports were conflicting. The official investigation had wrapped up too quickly, and now Angela Monroe was terrified to talk. And my father— I stared at my phone, my father's warning text illuminating the dimly lit room. Jack Carter wasn't a man to send cryptic messages. He was direct, a straight shooter. If he told me to back off, it meant something. I dialed his number. "Liv." His voice was steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "Dad, why did you text me that?" A pause. "You need to leave this alone." I clenched my jaw. "Why?" Another pause, then a sigh. "Because you don't know what you're walking into." "That's not an answer," I pressed. "No, but it's the only one you're getting. Drop it." Click. I stared at my phone, a chill creeping up my spine. My father wasn't just warning me. He was scared. The next morning, I found myself parked a few houses down from Angela's, drinking my 3rd cup of gas station coffee and contemplating my next move. I knew she had information. I just needed to get her to trust me. Movement at her front door caught my eye. Angela stepped outside, looking around anxiously before locking the door behind her. I hesitated only a second before grabbing my bag and stepping out of my car. "Angela!" She tensed, turning sharply. I expected her to ignore me, maybe even threaten to call the police. Instead, she bit her lip, then motioned for me to follow. My pulse quickened as I trailed her down the street and into a small coffee shop. She led me to a corner booth, waiting until we were seated before speaking. "You need to stop digging," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around her cup. I leaned forward. "Tell me why." Angela hesitated, glancing around. Then, in a whisper, she said, "Robert was killed because he knew something, and if you keep looking, they'll come for you too." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Who?" She shook her head. "I don't know. But I know they're watching. I know that fire wasn't an accident." My hands trembled slightly as I took notes. "Do you have proof?" She exhaled sharply, leaning closer. "There's a safety deposit box. Robert left instructions in case something happened to him. But if I access it, they'll know." 1,000 questions filled my mind, but before I could ask any, Angela's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "I have to go." She stood abruptly. "Don't contact me again." "Angela," but she was already out the door. I sat there, heart pounding. The fire had been no accident. Robert Monroe had known something worth killing over. And now I was in the middle of it. And someone was watching. The air in my apartment felt stale, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. I ran my fingers over the USB drive Claire had given me, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The footage wasn't perfect, glitchy, fragmented, but it was enough. Someone had fled before the fire started. Someone had known what was coming. I exhaled sharply and pulled my laptop closer. The figure in the footage was little more than a shadow, but the way they moved, a distinct limp on the right leg, was eerily familiar. I knew that gait. I'd seen it before. My stomach twisted, the memory clawing its way to the surface. Ethan. I shut the laptop with a snap, my hands trembling. No, it couldn't be. But the longer I sat in silence, the more the pieces slotted into place. Ethan's unease whenever I brought up the fire, the way he always seemed to change the subject. And now this, the evidence staring me in the face. The USB burned in my palm like a brand, as if it carried all the answers I wasn't ready to face. I barely had time to register the knock at the door before it swung open. Ethan. His jaw was clenched tight, eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, fear, a lethal mix of both. "You need to stop, Liv," he said, his voice low. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." I forced my face into something unreadable, though my insides twisted. "Stop what?" Ethan's gaze flicked to the laptop, then back to me. "Digging." My breath hitched. He knew. I swallowed past the knot in my throat. "So it's true then. You were there before the fire started." His silence was answer enough. I took a step forward, my fingers curling into fists. "Did you set it?" His laugh was humorless. "You really think that?" "I don't know what to think anymore, Ethan. I thought I knew you." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," I demanded. because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me this whole time." He hesitated, something flickering across his face. Regret, maybe? "I can't," I scoffed. "Can't or won't." Ethan took a slow, deliberate step closer. "There are things you don't understand, Liv. And if you keep pushing, it's going to get dangerous." I refused to back down. "I can take care of myself." He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You have no idea who you're up against." The weight of his words settled over me like a storm cloud. It wasn't just guilt in his eyes. It was something more, something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "I need answers," I whispered. "If you won't give them to me, I'll find them myself." Ethan's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." Before I could react, he turned and strode out, slamming the door behind him. The finality of it sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I was this close to the truth, no matter the cost. I stared at the crumpled note in my hand, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Drop the story, or you'll regret it." My breath came in short gasps as I read it again, hoping the words would somehow change, that they wouldn't carry the weight I knew they did. Someone was trying to scare me off Ethan's case. I pressed my back against the wall of my tiny apartment, scanning the room as if the threat's author might materialize from the shadows. My fingers tightened around the paper, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. Whoever sent this note wasn't bluffing, not after what I'd just discovered. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. The newsroom was nearly empty when I stormed in, the overhead fluorescents buzzing as I made my way to Marcus's office. He was hunched over his desk, rubbing his temples, but he sat up when he saw me. His expression darkened when I threw the note onto his desk. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Marcus picked up the note, his lips pressing into a grim line. "Where did you get this?" "Someone left it under my door." I crossed my arms, my stomach twisting. "I don't have enemies, Marcus. The only thing I've been working on is Ethan's case." He sighed, rubbing his face. "Liv, I told you to be careful." "That's not an answer." Marcus hesitated, and I caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes. He had been holding something back. I knew it. "You always suspected Ethan, didn't you?" I said. "But you backed off? Why?" He glanced at the glass walls of his office, then leaned in. "Because I didn't have a choice." The admission sent a chill down my spine. "Ethan was connected to people with real power," he continued. "When I started digging, I was warned to stop. The paper got a call from someone high up, someone who could make our lives hell." He exhaled sharply. "I couldn't risk the entire newsroom, so I let it go." "But you knew he wasn't innocent." He shook his head. "I suspected, but I had no proof." He tapped the note. "And now it looks like you're getting the same treatment." I clenched my fists. "I'm not dropping this." Marcus gave me a long, measured look. "Then be ready, Liv, because they won't stop at threats." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of my apartment sent my heart racing. I kept the lights on, my laptop open, scrolling through my notes on Ethan's case, searching for anything I might have missed. By morning, exhaustion clung to me, but I forced myself to push forward. I grabbed my bag, my recorder, and my notes, and headed out to meet a contact who claimed to have new information on Ethan. When I returned, my world tilted. The door to my apartment was ajar. My breath hitched. My hands trembled as I pushed it open the rest of the way. Inside, my place was a disaster. Cushions were slashed open, my desk drawers pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. My books were tossed from the shelves, pages torn. But it was the emptiness that hit me the hardest. The only thing missing was my folder on Ethan's case. My legs wobbled beneath me. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. Someone was covering their tracks, making sure I had nothing left to work with. I swallowed the fear rising in my throat. They thought they could silence me. They were wrong. I grabbed my phone and dialed Marcus. The second he answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. My apartment was broken into, I said, my voice cold. They took everything on Ethan. Silence, then a quiet curse. Liv, listen to me. No, you listen. They wouldn't go this far unless I was on to something. I forced down the panic clawing at my chest. I need to keep going. A long pause, then a heavy sigh. All right, Marcus said. Let's find out who really doesn't want this story told. I stood in Angela Monroe's dimly lit living room, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, but there was nothing warm about this moment. Angela sat on the edge of her couch, her hands clenched around a crumpled tissue. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and her lips trembled as she spoke. My husband had proof, Liv, she whispered. That fire. She squeezed her eyes shut as if trying to force herself to say the words. It wasn't an accident. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Angela, you have to tell me everything. She nodded, her hands gripping the armrests as if the story itself was physically painful to release. Nathan was working on something big. He had documents, recordings, everything. He told me he was close to exposing something huge. Then he was killed. Her voice cracked on the last word. I gritted my teeth. Nathan Monroe had been a respected journalist. His death, officially ruled as a hit and run, had never sat right with me. And now I knew why. What did he find? I asked, leaning in. Angela inhaled shakily. He found out that the fire at the Meridian warehouse wasn't just some freak accident. It was deliberate. A cover-up for a deal gone wrong. The mayor, Langston, he was involved. And so was Ethan. Ethan. His name hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan Hart. The man who had been hailed as a hero that night. The man I had spent weeks investigating, trying to understand his past, his motivations. The man I shook my head, refusing to complete that thought. There's no way, I muttered. Ethan was inside the warehouse when it happened. He pulled people out. He saved lives. Angela exhaled sharply. I know what people say about him. I know what you think about him, too. But Nathan was certain. Ethan was there for a reason that night, and it wasn't just to save people. My stomach churned. Do you have proof? Anything? Angela hesitated, then stood abruptly. Wait here. She disappeared down the hallway, her feet barely making a sound on the carpet. I sat there, trying to process what I had just heard. If Ethan had been involved in starting the fire, then everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. But why? Why would he do it? Angela returned a moment later with a small, worn, leather-bound journal. She held it out to me, her hands shaking. "This is all I have left," she said. "Nathan hid the rest of his findings, but I don't know where." I took the journal gingerly, flipping it open. The pages were filled with Nathan's tight, slanted handwriting, notes, dates, names. My eyes widened as I skimmed over familiar ones. Mayor Langston, Ethan Hart, the Meridian Warehouse. And then one phrase jumped out at me. The fire was supposed to erase the evidence. They didn't expect survivors. My breath hitched. "Liv," Angela said softly, "you need to be careful." I looked up at her. If this is true, if Ethan really was involved, then why would he go back in? Why risk his life? Angela pressed her lips together. Maybe he had no choice. Maybe he was covering his tracks, or maybe... She hesitated. Maybe he wasn't as much of a villain as he thought he was. That thought unsettled me even more. I glanced back at the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. Whatever secrets Nathan had uncovered, they had cost him his life. And now they had fallen into mine. I exhaled sharply and shut the book. I need to find out the rest of the truth. Angela's eyes darkened. Then you better move fast. Because if Ethan was involved, you can bet that the people behind this won't want you digging any further. I nodded, slipping the journal into my bag. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood. "Thank you, Angela." She gave me a sad smile. "Just be careful, Liv." I left her house with the journal burning in my hands like a live wire. The night air was crisp, but I barely felt it as I climbed into my car. My fingers gripped the steering wheel as I stared out at the empty street. Ethan. Had I been chasing a ghost all along, or had I been chasing a lie? There was only one way to find out. I started the car, my mind already spinning through the next steps. First, I needed to read every word in Nathan's journal. Then I needed to find Ethan. Because if he really had been part of something this dark, I needed to hear it from him. I needed to know if the hero I had believed in was actually a monster hiding in plain sight. I never thought the weight of my own past would suffocate me. It sat heavy in my chest, clawing at my ribs, threatening to rip me apart. But here I was, standing at the edge of everything I thought I knew, staring into the abyss of what was real and what had been hidden from me for 15 years. Claire had called me barely an hour ago, her voice tight with urgency. "Liv, there's something you need to see." I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to ignore whatever bombshell she was about to drop, because I had convinced myself that I already knew the worst. Ethan had been there that night. He had been responsible. I had spent weeks piecing it all together, preparing for the moment my truth would become public. But Claire, relentless as always, had one last revelation. Ethan wasn't alone. The grainy surveillance footage Claire showed me was nearly unrecognizable. Dark, distorted, but damning nonetheless. Two figures moved through the frame. Ethan was one of them. The other I couldn't place. Or maybe I just refused to. My father had been hesitant to meet with me. I could hear it in his voice when I called him, the hesitation laced with something I couldn't quite name. Guilt, regret, fear. When I arrived at his house, he looked smaller somehow. The man who had always been my unwavering foundation now seemed weighed down by something much heavier than time. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me at first. Instead, he stared at the old oak table between us, as though it held the answers to the past. I sat down, my hands curling into fists. "I need the truth." He exhaled slowly, his fingers threading through his graying hair. "I was trying to protect someone, Liv." I clenched my jaw. "Yeah, Ethan, you covered for him. You let him walk free?" "No." His voice was sharp, cutting through my anger like a blade. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there sent a cold shiver through me. It wasn't Ethan I was protecting. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. My stomach lurched, my pulse pounded in my ears. "What are you saying?" He swallowed hard. "Your mother, Liv. She was there that night." The words hit me like a physical blow. No, she wasn't. "I tried to keep you away from this, to keep the past buried," he said, voice thick with sorrow. "But it's time you know the truth." I shook my head, my breath coming in short gasps. "You're lying." I wish I was. The walls of my father's house felt like they were closing in. My mother, the woman who had tucked me in at night, who had kissed my forehead and told me everything would be okay. She had been there. She had been part of this. Why? My voice broke on the single word. My father's gaze fell to his hands. Because she loved Ethan's father. Silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. "What?" He sighed, his shoulders sagging further. "They were having an affair, Liv. That night she was supposed to meet him, but something went wrong. She was there when it happened, and she saw..." His voice faltered. "She saw everything." I covered my mouth with my hand, bile rising in my throat. "And you covered it up." He nodded. "To protect her. To protect you." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You let me believe a lie for 15 years. You let Ethan believe he was the only one who had something to hide." My father's eyes shone with unshed tears. I thought I was doing the right thing. I pushed back from the table so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "You destroyed lives, Dad," my voice cracked, "including mine." His expression crumpled, but I couldn't look at him anymore. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to understand how my entire world had just been rewritten in an instant. I stumbled out onto the porch, the cool night air biting at my skin. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing, trying to steady myself. The betrayal sank deeper than I ever could have imagined. This wasn't just Ethan's secret. This wasn't just his burden. It was mine too. And now I had to decide what to do with the truth. The weight of my decision pressed down on me like an anvil. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking, impatient. I had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of what I was about to do. The story was ready, every detail laid out, every interview meticulously documented. But publishing it meant exposing everything. Mayor Langston's corruption, Ethan's true role in the fire, and my own family's connection to it all. My pulse drummed in my ears as I read over the final draft. I had taken great care, stripping away anything that might destroy innocent lives. The truth deserved to be told, but I wouldn't let it be a wrecking ball for those who didn't deserve the fallout. With one deep breath, I hit publish. The reaction was immediate. The city erupted in chaos as the news spread like wildfire. Mayor Langston resigned within hours, his team scrambling to control the damage, but it was too late. Investigations were launched, deals were exposed, and the public wanted justice. Then there was Ethan. The police found him trying to skip town. I imagined him sitting in the interrogation room, the walls closing in on him. The boy I had once thought I knew, now just another criminal with his back against the wall. When they finally arrested him, I had been there. Not by choice. I had been called in for questioning myself, my name now entwined with the scandal. He had looked at me, a strange mix of amusement and something darker playing behind his eyes. "You think you got the whole truth?" His voice was eerily calm as they pulled him away in cuffs. He leaned in slightly, just enough for me to hear. "Think again." Those words stayed with me, a parasite burrowing into my thoughts, feeding on my doubt. But I had done the right thing. I had exposed the truth. I had freed myself from the secrets that had weighed on me for too long. Hadn't I? The days that followed blurred together, interviews, threats, praise, backlash. The world wanted more. They wanted deeper scandals, juicier stories. But I was done. I had given everything I had. Or so I thought. A package arrived at my doorstep. I almost didn't open it. It had no return address, no markings, just a simple brown envelope sealed tight. My gut twisted as I tore it open, my fingers trembling. Inside was a single photograph. The edges were burned, charred, as if it had barely survived the very fire I had uncovered. And there, standing in the frame, was my mother. Beside her, clear as day, was Ethan. Not just any night, the night of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. My hands went numb. My mother, the one person I had never questioned, the one person I thought had no part in this. And yet, here she was, in the middle of it all. The truth had come out. But maybe not all of it. I wasn't sure I was ready for the rest.